Welcome to session 58 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. This is a monthly series that began as face-to-face meetings back in 2016, went online due to COVID in 2020, and has been continuing on more or less monthly. The name of the series kind of gives it away. It's about speculative fiction authors and the narrative worlds that they develop in their stories or novels, or pick whatever else it's going to be. Usually we're talking about more than one book. We're usually talking about a series by an author, although sometimes there are exceptions to that. And what we do is we look at the author, their biography, what they have to say about their work, what other people have to say about their work, and then we concentrate on the narrative universe, sort of spelling it out. What are the key elements of it? And we look for philosophical themes that we can explore. Now we follow this up with a Zoom conference right after this video premieres. During the video premiere, we have live chat, so I interact with people about that. And that is a substitute for the original meetings that we had for a number of years at the Brookfield Public Library, which were face-to-face, sitting around a table talking about these sorts of things. Now, session 58 is focused on Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy. I'm not going to be going into the later books that are set in the same narrative universe. Why? Because I haven't read them. You notice that I did spring for the boxed set of 3 books. The one that gets it all going, Philip Pullman, The Golden Compass, right? And then The Subtle Knife, just slightly shorter than the other one. And then the big thick one, book 3, The Amber Spyglass. Each of these identified with a particular artifact, as we'll talk about, and bringing in a character whose engagement with that artifact is going to be particularly important for the entire narrative universe. So I'm going to say a few things just before we jump into talking about Philip Pullman's biography and his corpus of works, and then we'll do some talk about the narrative universe, or rather universes, the multiverse involved in this. And I'll say that I had very low expectations heading into this because, I take suggestions from fans of and participants in this series every year about who we should do next, and I usually have some pretty clear ideas myself about who I want to do. And this was a fan favorite. People kept saying, oh, you got to do Philip Pullman. You've got to do His Dark Materials. You're going to really like it. And I think I was leery about that in part because of what's apparently kind of a off-base movie adaptation of it that was done. And I saw, advertisements for that, and I read some write-ups of it, and I was like, I don't know that that's the sort of thing I actually would be interested in doing. It sounds kind of like, cheap, reductive, easy writing sort of thing, hitting the notes that young adult fiction usually aims for. And I don't mean the good young adult fiction, I mean the shoddy kind of stuff that floods the market. And I will say that my experience with these books was the exact opposite. I started, of course, with The Golden Compass, began reading it, and, I was like, wow, this is very readable, and, I kind of like what's going on here. This is quite interesting, these characters. This is compelling fiction. And I got hooked, and I read my way through it in just a matter, in my spare time, a matter of a few days. And then I was like, wow, I got to read the next one. And so I went on to The Subtle Knife, where new characters are being introduced, the world is being widened, the scope of the narrative is being very expertly worked through. And I was like, holy crap, this is some good stuff. And Then we get to the final novel, and I couldn't wait to find out what was going to be going on here, and I plowed my way. Actually, didn't plow my way. I ran my way through it because it was so enjoyable. And you get to the end, and it's kind of a bittersweet ending. I won't give away the absolute spoilers about it. We'll just say that, it does involve these two characters of Will, who is brought out in the subtle knife, and, Lyra, who is mentioned on, I think, the very first sentence of this. Lyra and her diamond move through the darkening halls. So there's some really cool stuff going on there. I am a big fan now, and we've been trying to watch our way through the HBO adaptation, which seems pretty decent. Unfortunately, HBO doesn't play well with Amazon TV, so sometimes it doesn't actually work. But these books are certainly great. And I'm going to say this before I jump into the presentation proper. There's two things I want to say. One is these are essentially pitched as young adult YA novels. They certainly can be read by young adults, by adolescents. I would even say perhaps by smart elementary school students. But they're not just young adult novels. These are really well worked through and can appeal to older adults, 50-somethings like myself, who know a lot of the reference that Pullman is bringing up. And we can find a lot of great adventure, great tension, great joy, great sorrow. I found myself getting quite emotionally invested in these characters and in what was going on with them as I read through the stories. The other thing I'm going to say is that maybe one index of the quality of a work is that after you've read it once, you also want to reread it again. Not every work that I've read and talked about for Worlds of Speculative Fiction actually fits that, but these certainly do. I would definitely, in a year or two, I want to have some space from them, go ahead and reread them, and I think I would probably enjoy the narrative even more, even though I know what's coming up. It's that kind of work, it's that kind of literature. It's not dependent on revelations, it's dependent on the storytelling itself. And I imagine that a second read would be a deeper read, would catch more things that are woven into this story in matters of style, in matters of foreshadowing, in matters of how well the narrative is put together. So let's talk now about Philip Pullman himself. Philip Pullman is an author who is currently still living, writing, working, and engaging a vast public. I'm going to keep the biography section a little bit shorter than I usually do, in part because there's so much other things I want to get to. But there are some very important aspects of his life that I think we want to know about in order to make sense out of this narrative world and its, key aspects. So I was very interested to find out that he was born the same year as my own adoptive parents in 1946. He's born in Norwich, England, to Audrey Pullman and Alfred Pullman, who's a Royal Air Force pilot. And because of that, they end up traveling around a good bit, including to southern Rhodesia. He's educated in England, in Rhodesia at that time, now Zimbabwe, Australia. And his father is going to end up dying in a plane crash in Kenya. Posthumously, he'll be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. And Pullman himself in interviews talks about how at the time he thought his father was a great hero, and then later on he finds out that actually he was, engaged in strafing these guerrillas who really couldn't do much in response, the Mau Maus. And there were some intimations that perhaps the crash was something deliberate. In any case, they wind up settling in Wales, in Harlech Gwynedd, and spending time also in Norfolk with his grandfather. So the family is continuing on, and he's getting educated. As a matter of fact, in one interview, he talks about deliberately losing his London accent so he's not getting beaten up by the Welsh boys. Suddenly, he changes his tune. From his grandfather, who is a clergyman, he discovers John Milton's Paradise Lost, and that's going to have an important effect on him. He goes through schooling there. In 1965, he goes to Oxford, attending Exeter College. Oxford, like several other schools, is an entire assemblage of different colleges that you can go to. And Pullman says, I didn't actually do that well in school. I got I thought it was not quite the lowest marks, but that's because they discontinued some of the lower marks. He got a third-class BA. They were no longer offering fourth class in 1968. In 1970, he discovers William Blake and his illustrations and his writings. This, like Milton, is going to be a big influence upon him. That's also a very important year for other things. In 1970, he marries Judith Speller, who will have 2 children with, and he begins teaching children at Bishop Kirk Middle School. He winds up teaching at other places as well. And these children are ages 9 to 13. So what here in the United States we would say is sort of the end of elementary school, the beginning of middle school, or even junior high. And he's teaching for quite a while, and he's also writing school plays. After that, between 1988 and 1996, he also taught part-time at Westminster College, Oxford, continuing to do his writing. So this entire time, he is, carrying out a life. He's doing his writing and different projects. And by 1996, he can begin writing full-time. He can, leave behind this day job, you could say. And he writes a lot of things in the course of his career, which is still going on: children's novels, short stories, picture books, things specifically for children. He also writes plays and novels, comics, some nonfiction things. And there's 2 sets of stories and novels that we want to pick out. He writes a series of 4 Sally Lockhart novels about this young Victorian adventurer: The Ruby and the Smoke in 1985, The Shadow in the North, 1986, The Tiger in the Well, 1990, The Tin Princess, 1994. So you can see he's got a good series going, and then he adds to it over time. And then we have the series that we want to talk about here, his Dark Materials. So this begins in 1995 with Northern Lights, which is in its American version, the Golden Compass, right? And that's followed in 2 years by The Subtle Knife in 1997, and then 3 years later by the Amber Spyglass. So, a well spread out thing, but he doesn't stop there. There is a currently ongoing series, The Book of Dust, which picks up afterwards: La Belle Sauvage in 2017, The Secret Commonwealth in 2019. And then there's what are called companion books: Leiber's Oxford in 2003, Once Upon a Time in the North, 2008, The Collectors, 2014, and most recently, Serpentine. And these are adding more and more to the storytelling. There's a lot that happens in the course of his life that's quite interesting, and you can see that he's being honored. He's also making some very important commitments. So let's talk about some of the honors that are taking place. 2007, he's made an honorary professor at Bangor University. In 2009, he's actually awarded the degree of Doctor of Letters honoris causa by the University of Oxford, being recognized by his alma mater. And in 2019, he's actually knighted for service to literature. So he's actually Sir Philip Pullman. He also does a number of other things. For example, in 2013, he was elected president of the Society of Authors, very important British distinction. In 2008, he hosts the writer table for the Waterstones bookshop chain, highlighting 40 books that have influenced his career. He also gets invited to edit Grimm's fairy tales. 2009, he becomes a patron of the Palestine Festival of Literature. And this is a good segue into talking about his political and cultural commitments. He writes for The Guardian quite often, particularly about education, critical of the education policies in Britain and in other places. He also continues engaging the literary world. So 2008 and 2011, 2014 as well, he does a couple important interventions. 2008, he leads a campaign against age bans on the covers of children's books, saying, what do we mean at age bans? Well, ages 4 to 6 or ages 12 to 15. And Pullman says this is a really bad idea. We shouldn't do this. It's based on a one-dimensional view of growth. You're 7 now, so you read these. And then a whole bunch of other people join the campaign, booksellers, illustrators, librarians, teachers. He got his own publisher, Scholastic, to agree not to do that anymore. He also backs a campaign in 2011 to stop a number of library closures, and I love this line. He calls it a war against stupidity. And, we often take libraries for granted. They are such a wonderful resource that we have that many places in the world don't have access to. So keeping libraries open, something he was very passionate about. In 2014, it had to do with gender. He was involved in the Let Books Be Books campaign to stop children's books being labeled as either for girls or for boys. And he says, I'm against anything from age ranking to pinking and bluing, whose effect is to shut the door in the face of children who might enjoy coming in. No publisher should announce on the cover of any book the sort of readers the book would prefer. Let the readers decide for themselves. This is a principle that he will go back to over and over again. And, one of the tragedies that happened in Britain, and an avoidable tragedy, is the Grenfell Tower fire. He, in fact, in the second book of Dust, The Secret Commonwealth, he includes a character named after one of the victims of that tower fire, Nur Huda al-Wahhabi. And as part of the charity auction, Authors for Grenfell Tower, he offered the highest bidder a chance to name the character in the upcoming trilogy, raising over £30,000 in the process. So you can see that he is, we're just mentioning a few things here, he's very much somebody who is not an ivory tower type. He's very committed to thinking about our society that we live in. And, that draws quite a bit of fire. And I think the last thing that we should mention, before we jump into everything else, is the adaptations of his dark materials, right? So there's currently an HBO adaptation that seems to be fairly faithful. We've only watched a few episodes to the actual books, but there was also a movie version labeled The Golden Compass, which you could say took a lot of the fangs out of his literary presentation and effectively Christianized the book, Christianized the movie based on the book, which is not something that Pullman himself was happy with, because he does have a very strong commitment to a certain kind of atheism that we'll talk about a little bit more elsewhere where it's relevant. So that's the biography so far, just some thumbnail sketch of it. We learn quite a lot about what authors have in mind in working on their book by reading what they have to say in response to other people about that. And in some of the past videos that I've done, I think I've lingered a little bit too much over reviews. And so in this one, I'm just going to confine myself to interviews that were done with Philip Pullman that touch on important aspects of this trilogy and where he's coming from as a writer. So the first topic has to do with these being viewed as children's literature or as young adult or any of that sort of classification. And in a Slate interview that was done 20 years after the release of Northern Lights or The Golden Compass, he is asked, "We talk a lot about young adult fiction and who reads it and why. Is The Golden Compass young adult fiction? What makes young adult fiction different from regular adult fiction?" And his answer is, it's a very complicated question. I don't know whether The Golden Compass is a young adult book or a children's book or an adult book that somehow sneaked its way into a children's bookstore. I don't actually think about the audience. I don't think about my readers at all. I think about the story I'm writing and whether I'm writing it clearly enough to please me. If you asked what sort of audience I would like, I would say a mixed one, please. Children keep your attention on the story because you want to tell it so clearly that nobody wishes to stop listening. And the adults remind you not to patronize or underestimate the intelligence of the children. So that's, kind of an interesting way of framing what he's doing. In another interview where a bunch of school children wrote into him with questions, and they said, how old is the reader that you're aiming at? He said, a reader my age. So he's writing to himself. In another interview in The New Yorker, he was asked, I gather you continue to think highly of adolescence, which is not everybody's opinion. And Pullman says, well, it's an interesting time. When I became a teacher, I was teaching children who were 11 to 13, that sort of age. Their lives were beginning to open out in terms of intellectual curiosity, in terms of emotional maturity, in terms of physical changes. It's a complete earthquake of a time. And I've always thought it was very important. It's the change, as William Blake puts it so well, between innocence and experience. And particularly in the third book, we find that, the main characters, Will and Lyra, are approaching their adolescence, the point where their daimons are going to become fixed in one state or another. They're shifting around all the time until then. And by the end, they do adopt forms that they're going to have. The interview continues saying, that's one of your great themes, going back to between innocence and experience. But one thing that occurs to me is that sometimes teenagers can have a kind of nostalgia for their childhoods, even though they're not that far removed from them. It's the dawning of an awareness that for the first time they're moving past an age or a period of life they're not going to be able to recover. Philip Pullman responds, I suppose that happens. But most kids, I think, look forward rather than back. They want to be grown up. They want to smoke cigarettes and get drunk and have sex. And they want to have a bit of money and drive around in cars. It's only when you're kind of mature, maybe in your 40s, or when you've got kids yourself, that you think, oh, wouldn't it be nice if I could go to bed and have a story read to me and then just go to sleep without having to get up and go to a job in the morning. The nostalgia is an adult thing, not a childhood thing. I think these are interesting ways to think not just about what Pullman has to say about childhood and adulthood, but to think about the work that he's doing and whether these are, in fact, children's stories that are being, also multi-purposed as adult stories, or whether there's something different going on there. And then, in other interviews, he brings up other fantasy writers, or rather these are pitched to him. In the 20-year Slate interview, he's asked, you said you're not a huge admirer of C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien, both of whom have written fantasies that in some ways resemble The Golden Compass. Is it fair to say that these books have a somewhat didactic relationship to readers? Now, a didactic relationship, this is something that we were supposed to avoid when I was young and we were doing writing, because didactic was kind of a bad word, meaning that you're trying to teach people along the way. You're preaching rather than telling a good story. So, what does Pullman say? They're often bracketed together, Tolkien and Lewis, which is, I suppose, quite fair, because they were great friends, both Oxford writers and scholars, both Christians. Tolkien's work has very little of interest in it to a reader of literature, in my opinion. When I think of literature, Dickens, George Eliot, Joseph Conrad, the great novelists found their subject matter in human nature, emotion, in the ways we relate to each other. If that's what Tolkien's up to, he's left out half of it. The books are wholly male-oriented. The entire question of sexual relationships is omitted. Tolkien was Catholic, which meant for him that there were no questions about religion. The church had all the answers. But Lewis was different. He was a Protestant, an Irish Protestant at that, from a tradition of arguing with God and wrestling with morality. His work is not frivolous in the way that Tolkien is frivolous, though it seems odd to call a novel of great intricacy and enormous popularity frivolous. I just don't like the conclusion Lewis comes to after all that analysis, the way that he shuts children out from heaven, or whatever it is, on the grounds that one girl is interested in boys. She's a teenager. It's terrible. Sex, can't have that. And yet I respect Lewis more than I do Tolkien. Now, him saying that he respects Lewis more than he does Tolkien is not saying, well, Tolkien failed to measure up to this lofty level that Lewis was at. He doesn't particularly like Lewis. And in the High Profiles interview, he says, Lewis is a contradictory sort of character for me. I loathe the Narnia books, and I loathe the so-called space trilogy because they contain an ugly vision. But when he was talking about writing for children, and about literature in general, Lewis was very, very acute and said some very perceptive and wise things. As a critic and as a psychologist, the Screwtape Letters, for example, is full of very shrewd stuff about what it's like to be tempted. I rate him very highly, but I do detest what he was doing in his fiction. So, some engagement with the previous people that he's being compared to. In the interview, the 20-year Slate interview, the interviewer says, to move on to someone who you respect quite a bit, Milton, there's so many parallels between the Golden Compass and Paradise Lost. Lord Asriel must be Satan, right, with his starry name and ambition and dark magnetism. And then there are all the Miltonic similes and the bear fight and witches sometimes playing the role of the angels. What other Miltonic Easter eggs should we look out for? Do you have a favorite one? And Pullman says, well, the Dark Materials is, of course, a retelling of the Miltonic temptation and fall, but most of that happens after the Golden Compass ends. What I wanted to do is represent the fall as entirely good. It is good for people to know things, to grow up, to become sexual beings, which shows that he's doing something different than Milton in many respects. The interviewer followed up and said, how conscious of Milton in that story were you when you were actually writing? And he says, well, it wasn't a sentence-on-sentence basis, but you mentioned Miltonic similes, and those were deliberate allusions. The epic context demanded there be a certain epic quality to the language. I didn't get close to Milton, though, and there was never a moment in the writing process where I felt, oh, I've got that wrong, I'd better change it. It is my story, and I'll do what I want with it. I remember the words of William Blake, I must create my own system or be enslaved by another man's. And I think that's in effect what is happening here in the world building, creation of other systems and a vast cosmic system as well. In the New Yorker interview, he's being asked about religion, and he says, it was when I became a teenager and started reading for myself that the faith fell away. But that didn't mean that I sprang into the world as a militant atheist. What I'm against is what William Blake called single vision, being possessed by one single idea and seeing everything in terms of this idea, whether it's a religious idea or a scientific idea or a political idea. It's a very bad thing. We need a multiplicity of viewpoints. So I'm perfectly willing to entertain the prospect of the secret commonwealth, this world of fairies, ghosts, witches, and so on, side by side with the world of reason. I wouldn't want to be governed by one or the other. And again, I think that's what we see depicted in these books. Interestingly, in the High Profiles interview, somebody says, a lot of people assume from the Amber Spyglass that you must be an atheist. The Amber Spyglass, of course, being the final and largest of these novels. And he says, well, they can assume what they like. Of course, I don't say there is no God. I say there is a God, and here he is dying. And this is what I was most particularly pleased with. As a result of an act of charity, and he goes with a sigh of the most profound and exhausted relief. And then he says, the interviewer says, but God is an imposter. He's the first angel, who is himself the accidental byproduct of a meaningless universe, the interviewer says. And now, here's where Pullman says something I think really quite important and interesting. It's not meaningless. It was meaningless before, but it's not meaningless anymore. This is the mistake Christians make when they say if you are an atheist, you have to be a nihilist and there's no meaning anymore. That's nonsense, as Mary Malone discovers. Now that I'm conscious, now that I'm responsible, there is a meaning, and it is to make things better and to work for greater good and greater wisdom. That's my meaning, and it comes from my understanding of my position. It's not nihilism at all. It's very far from it. And we should pause here for a moment and think about this. Is this framed in a kind of Nietzschean way? We just saw that he says that God is dying, right? And he mentions God dying of supreme charity, right? That sounds like the dying or dead God in Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche thought that nihilism is indeed the problem of the 20th century, and I'd say it goes on into the 21st century as well, as the central problem. What do we human beings do when the highest value devaluates itself? Well, one response might be to acquire power, to express the will to power, to become the Übermensch, right? Another is a little bit more down to earth, saying we don't need to do all of this wild, crazy stuff. I mean, we can fight against heaven if we wish to, but we might also think about fulfilling our duties, recognizing what the right thing to do is, and then doing the difficult work of sticking to it once we've committed to it. And that is what Will and Lyra and Seraphina and so many other characters do in this story. So I think that's quite profound there. In the Textualities interview, he's actually asked, have you ever yourself had any experience that could be described as a state of grace or mystical? And Pullman says, yes, I have. Not very often, I may add, probably only 3 or 4 times. It has to do with seeing things more clearly. Mystical experience is sometimes described as a cloudy state when the real world dissolves. For me, it's not been like that, or else what I've had has not been mystical experience. What I seem to feel was that I saw the connections between things much more clearly, much more vividly. There were patterns, there were correspondences, there were shadows here of something there. Everything was connected. With enormous excitement, I could see that the universe was alive and I was part of it. I saw this so clearly and intensely, I don't think I could sustain that state for very long. So, Pullman is far from a militant atheist. All of this is, if we were attacking British, all this is rubbish. No, he doesn't take that point of view. And I think that his point of view is compatible with, say, people like William James or George Santayana or other figures, perhaps even with people like Kierkegaard or Gabriel Marcel. He's asked again in that interview, do you think there is such a thing as wisdom? He says, yes, there is. And it is to do with that sense of the connection between things and the meaning of things, which is the same, actually. The meaning of something is its connection to other things. The more connections you see, the more meaning you see. So that, again, very interesting point of view. Now, there's a few other things that he says that I think are worth bringing up. In the Slate interview, 20 years, he said, with 20 years of hindsight, is there anything you would have done differently if you were rewriting his Dark Materials? He says, no, those works are complete. Actually, I wouldn't change the first 2. With the Amber Spyglass, the final one, I would have liked to have taken another 6 months. But so many people were writing me and begging me, hurry up, hurry up. I don't feel that it's a bad book, though. I'm happy with it. So that is really, if you think about the capacity for us to tinker around with things almost indefinitely, that's a sign that he feels that this is a really solid set of works. Finally, the last thing from the Lit Hub interview. I think this is a great way to end this little segment. Was there ever a moment when you felt the story started telling you? Now, this is a little complex. Notice what he says here. Yes, to an extent it did. There are things a story wants to do and things that you want to do. And in the end, the story wins because it knows better than I do. There's an odd sense that one is discovering rather than inventing. There's a sense in which the story almost seems to be there in some platonic realm, and what I must do is try to transmit that pure sense to paper rather than go in for any clever stuff of my own. It's curious, because I don't actually believe in platonic realms of pure being, yet writing feels more like discovering rather than merely going along with a literary construct that's only made of words. So I do believe instinctively that it is in fact all out there somewhere, and I'm just writing it down. I can't justify that at all, but there it is. So that's, something like a platonic realm that he doesn't actually believe in. Philip Pullman, you could say, is rather of an empiricist. He wants to see what's actually there and to not prejudge ahead of time. No, this can't be this can't be this, either atheism or Christianity. You can't, He's a pluralist. He's, in some sense, an empiricist, a radical empiricist like William James is, and he's bringing together elements and ideas and thematics that are drawn, for example, from Milton or from Blake, who he brings up all the time, but he's creating something new of his own in the process. It's time now that we talk about the narrative world, or rather worlds, a multiverse that we find developed within these 3 novels by Philip Pullman. And one of the things that we can say that I think is actually a strength of the work is that Pullman does a good bit of world building and exposition within the novels themselves without spelling out too much. So he's sort of like Ursula K. Leguin in how she develops, Earthsea, and, we get to see a glimpse of bits of it in the first novel, and then there's more and more that she develops. And she says that, I made a map first, and then I started thinking, well, what goes on over here? And what are the people like over here? What kind of stories can I tell? With Pullman, what we get is it's centered around characters and their interactions. And we get to see the world through what they say or what they experience or what they're doing. And at first, we don't actually get to see much of this multiverse. As a matter of fact, we never get to see an awful lot of it because so much of it is just terra incognita, unknown land, or rather unknown worlds. And even in the worlds that we do know, much of it remains unknown as well. So things begin in the Golden Compass, and this is a world that has Oxford, for example, which is like our world, right? But it's developed differently. There's important differences between that world and our own world. And some of these have to do with who are the inhabitants of it. There's an entire race of witches, for example. There are polar bears that speak and think like human beings but have their own bear nature and put on their armor, which is like their soul, and all sorts of interesting different features like that. History has gone a good bit differently. There are, things that we can reasonably identify, but the political situation that we're used to, and we can say also the situation of culture and education, is considerably different. There's a group of people who are sort of modeled off of the Roma, the Egyptians, who are sort of wandering people who have this network all over the place, and they get involved in a very important way as well. And within that world, there is something called the magisterium. Now, we would normally associate that with the Catholic Church, wouldn't we? Interestingly, John Calvin in this story has been a great leader, indeed a pope of the magisterium. And the magisterium is what people have imagined the Catholic Church to be like in a global sense, that it's only been like in local senses. You know, like when people think of the Inquisition, right? Which, by the way, provoked a lot of discord within the church itself. You know, whether we're talking about the Spanish Inquisition or the German witch-finding Inquisition, the Vatican was not super happy about what was going on there. But imagine like some of the worst stereotypes of the church, or specifically about, like, say, the Jesuits or the Inquisition. And there you've got the magisterium. They want to keep control over things. And there's, as we're going to find out, an entire backstory about the supernatural being and beings, angels, and God that's being referred to in all of this. And so that's an important aspect. You could say that there is technology of all sorts. I mean, a golden compass, the truth meter, right? The aletheometer, that plays an important role in this. There's, firepower that can be turned against people, and there's balloons and all sorts of cool stuff going on. But things are different. So experimental theologians there are what we call scientists here in our world. And by the time we get to the end of this work, what we find is that Lyra's, at first uncle, actually father, is engaging in a great experiment trying to break the walls between the worlds. And he succeeds, using some super great power to do that. Her father is going to try to destroy, as we're going to talk about, the essence of dust later on. We'll discuss what dust is when we get to philosophical themes. And her father is going to breach what the Aurora Borealis has been showing us, the veil between worlds. The Aurora Borealis, looked at in the right lens, you can see cities beyond the clouds. So that's an important aspect. That's all happening within this novel. The gateway is opened up there, and her father goes through. Lyra goes through as well, and finds herself in another world, another dimension, which is not radically different, but is different enough from the world that we're inhabiting, which is where the second novel begins. The second novel begins with Will tugging his mother's hand and saying, "Come on." He's essentially not abandoning his mother, but giving her over to this piano teacher, Mrs. Cooper, and saying, "You need to take care of her for a while. I'll be in touch when I can." And we find that Will makes his way through into a gateway into another dimension. And this is where Lyra is, and they meet up, and there's, things going on between them, right? There's other things happening in Lyra's world that she's now left. So now we have three worlds going on. We have the world of our world. We have this other place, the city that's set in a basically Italian setting. And then we have Lyra's original world. And with the knife, we find out that you can cut into other dimensions. And that's what Will ends up doing. We wind up going into a number of other worlds, sometimes just as a sort of dodge, because the topography of the worlds preserves a certain continuity to each other. You can cut a hole over here, go 10 paces that way, cut a hole, step back into the world that you were originally from, and you've gone 10 paces. So that's a really important aspect to it. The worlds get even more complex and varied when we get into the Amber Spyglass, where we pick up a third, we could call her a main character, right? Somebody who is brought up in the first story, right? And she's Mary, former nun, and she is going to be going into yet a different world, one where evolution has actually worked differently than our world. Very, very differently. In the fact that there are creatures who don't have a central spine. They are in kind of a diamond shape with their bones. And they are not only sentient, they are intelligent creatures. So intelligence has arisen in many different forms, in many different places. Mary Malone, right? And so she is becoming another main character. And the world that she lives in is another important one. But then there's yet an even more interesting one. Will and Lyra are going to go down, or go to, the world of the dead, where it is that souls go after a person has died and they have left behind their daimon, and they are now moving into a different realm where they're tortured by harpies and there is no escape from it. That is also part of it. Will manages to open up a gateway back to the other worlds for the dead, who are going to exit this immense land of the dead as well. And why do they go down there? Well, because Roger, Lyra's friend, has been communicating with her through her dreams, and he's stuck in the land of the dead. He was the one whose connection to his diamond furnished the energy for opening up the portal that Lord Asriel, Lyra's father, originally did in the first book towards the end of it. And what we have are all these interconnected dimensions and worlds. The knife has been able to open up a lot of portals. Will, the knife wielder, can also close the portals as well. And it turns out, opening up all these portals created what we might call, I'm tempted to use the word ecological crisis, but perhaps that is not a big enough term. Usually when we think about ecology, we're thinking about like the entire planet, right, of Earth, and we're saying let's take a big picture approach, a long-term approach, all these interconnected systems, and we need to be careful about them, or if things get out of balance, we need to try to figure out how we can rebalance them, or we move from one key era to another through the massive paradigm shifts. We might be in the middle of one. People call this the Anthropocene right now, where we've managed to really disrupt the world that we live in. But that's only one world. If we're talking about multiple worlds, then is the word ecological even the right word? We need something kind of bigger, like a multiverse ecological. I don't know what we should call it. Maybe people have good suggestions about that. But there's a crisis that is happening across all the different worlds. A crisis in addition to the other crises that are happening. Like, in Lyra's world, it's getting warmer, and the polar bears are needing to find a place to migrate to because their homes are starting to break up. The dust itself, or the dark matter, or all the other things that it's called in these other worlds are going to different places, and that is disrupting. For example, in the world that Mary goes to, where there are these intelligent creatures that have a relation with a particular tree, the trees are no longer getting fertilized and they're dying because the dust is flowing away, flowing out of that world into a void, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on. Ultimately, the story becomes, well, there's several things entangled there, right? We have the, I'm going to overthrow the god, the deity that was set up to be like the thing that the magisterium is supposedly worshiping, and in the place of that Lord Asriel and his army are doing. There's some really interesting stuff going on there that we'll talk about. There's also, warring going on in other ways, people trying to control this. And there's this sense of we need to fix what's happening or everything is going to fall apart. And everything that's great within the, not just world, but the universe, the multiverse is going to die out, including this intelligent dark matter, the dark materials perhaps being referenced there, the dust that has been generated and played such an important role in all of these worlds and their development. So there's a lot going on with the worlds that we're exploring here. I'll just wrap up by saying this. We're dealing with a multiverse in which there are many different kinds of sentient creatures, all of whom are essentially given some place, some sketching out by Philip Pullman. Human beings are really at the center of things, but there's many others that play central roles as well. One of the very interesting philosophical themes that runs throughout this entire trilogy, and you might say throughout the entire world, not only of Lyra, but also our own world, has to do with these daimons. And we see it in the very first line of the first chapter of The Golden Compass. Lyra and her daimon move through the darkening hall, taking care to keep to one side, out of sight of the kitchen. And we also find out something else about daimons, right? The daimon speaks to her. "You're not taking this seriously," whispered her daimon. "Behave yourself." Her daimon's name was Pantalaimon, and he was currently in the form of a moth, a dark brown one, so as not to show up in the darkness of the hall. "They're making too much noise to hear from the kitchen," Lyra whispered back, "and the steward doesn't come in till the first bell. Stop fussing." But she put her palm over the ringing crystal anyway, and Pantalaimon fluttered ahead and through the slightly open door of the retiring room. After a moment, he appeared again. "There's no one here," he whispered, "but we must be quick." And everybody well, actually we should be careful about saying that, because there are going to be some people separated from their daimones later on in the story. But generally, everybody has their daimon, and we learn throughout this work that the daimons do something very important. They assume all these different animal shapes, shifting from one to the other until a certain point in a child's life. When they're moving into adulthood, they take on a fixed shape. And people get the daimons, as we find out in the Golden Compass, not necessarily what they want, but what it is that expresses them. Because the daimon is them. It is part of themselves that has been externalized. It is a portion of their soul, you might say, right? That's the way it is for people in this world. Now, we do find out that there are ways to separate a daimon away from a person. This gets done to soldiers to make them into something like mindless automatons. It also is being done to children up in the north. The oblation board, actually run by Lyra's mother, is carrying out experiments to do this sort of thing. Lyra almost has this happen to herself, and it does happen to her friend Roger, generating the energy which breaks the gap in between worlds. And we hear something really gruesome about what daimons end up, in some cases having to do early on in the story. They're talking about the breathless ones. And who are these? Warriors half killed. Being alive is one thing and being dead's another, but being half killed is worse than either. They just can't die, and living is altogether beyond them. They wander around forever. They're called the breathless ones because of what's been done to them. "And what's that?" Lyra asked, wide-eyed. "The North Tartars snap open their ribs and pull out their lungs. There's an art to it. They do it without killing them, but their lungs can't work anymore without their daimons pumping them by hand. The result is that they're halfway between breath and no breath, life and death half killed, you see. And their daimons got to pump and pump all day and night or else perish with them. You sometimes come across a whole platoon of the breathless ones in the forest sometime, right? So this is a very interesting thing to bring up. The daimons, they help to keep you alive. They look out for you. But if you die, the daimon disappears into dust as well. So it is you. And there are a number of different, what we could call, they're called taboos having to do with the daimons. You're not supposed to touch another person's daimon. The daimons themselves will, scrap with each other or, caress each other, or do whatever they're going to do. But you're not supposed to touch another human being's daimon. And it's not just human beings themselves who have them. It turns out that the witches also have them, and the witches can have their daimon go somewhere else. The witches are always birds, like a goose or a wren or whatever, and the daimon can operate independently, whereas for ordinary people, the daimon can't go that far from you without you feeling a real sense of unease at first and then physical pain within yourself. There is one exception to this, and this comes up, with Lyra's mother and the oblation board. There is a scene where this golden monkey, who is her mother's daimon, Mrs. Coulter's daimon, is off doing its own thing, actually poking around in her room. And so, that's kind of an exception. Is her mother kind of like a witch? She's certainly somebody possessed of a very strong personality, as is Lyra's actual father, Lord Azrael. And, they both have very powerful daimones. There's another conversation that takes place as well, which is quite interesting, that we should reference, and that happens in the Golden Compass too, when Lyra is talking with, as it turns out, the king of the bears, who is working in a metal shop and drinking and stuff like that, in exile from his kingdom. She is going to ask him, about his armor, and the armor that a bear has, which they make themselves, is sort of an analog to the soul, the daimon that a person has. Except, as Lyra points out, there's a very important difference. You can make your own armor, right? You can't make your own daimon. You're born with it. So those are some really interesting things that come up. And then, in The Subtle Knife, we encounter a guy from our world who does not have a daimon, at least we think, and that's Will. And what we do find out is that, here we go. Lyra says she could see the intensity in his body, saw his jaw working, saw an authority descend over it, calming, relaxing, and clarifying. The authority was Will's own, or his daimon's, perhaps. How he must miss having a daimon, the loneliness of it. No wonder he'd cried. And it was right of Pantaleon to do what he'd done, though it had felt so strange here when he touched Will, right? And as it turns out, Will and everybody in our world does, in fact, have them. They're just in us rather than out there, visible agency in the world. And we're going to find out in the third book, The Amber Spyglass, when Will and Lyra and several others descend to the land of the dead, that Will does in fact have a daimon. So they're at this place with the boatman, and the boatman is going to take Lyra across, but there's a price, a terrible price that has to be paid. So Will got in first, then Lyra came forward to step down too, but the boatman held up his hand. "Not him," he said in a harsh whisper. "Not who?" "Not him." He extended a yellow-gray finger, pointing directly at Pantaleon, whose red-brown stoat form immediately became ermine white. "But he is me," Lyra said. "If you come, he must stay." "But we can't. We'd die. Isn't that what you want?" And then, for the first time, Lyra truly realized what she was doing. This was the real consequence. She stood aghast, trembling, and clutched her dear daimon so tightly that he whimpered in pain. "They," said Lyra helplessly, then stopped. It wasn't fair to point out that the other three didn't have to give anything up. Will was watching her anxiously. She looked all around, at the lake, at the jetty, at the rough path, at the stagnant puddles, the dead and sodden bushes. Her Pan, alone here. How could he live without her? He was shaking inside her shirt against her bare flesh, his fur needing her warmth. Impossible. Never. "He must stay here if you are to come," the boatman said again. And he says, "If she comes, he has to stay." Will said, "That's not right. We don't have to leave part of ourselves behind. Why should Lyra?" And then here's where we get a revelation. "Oh, but you do," said the boatman. "It's her misfortune that she can see and talk to the part that you must leave. You will not know until you are on the water, and then it will be too late. But you have to leave that part of yourselves here. There is no passage to the land of the dead for such as him." And what we find is that Will does, in fact, have a daimon, and it's left behind on the pier, and it feels awful for him. And, eventually, what we find later on in the Amber Spyglass, after they make it out of the land of the dead, is their daimons are reluctant to come back to them. It takes a long time for them to be rejoined. But their daimons also are off spending time with each other. And that may be part of, you can say there's a reflection of the growing love that Will and Lyra have for each other. There's also this, beautiful passage, a very martial passage, where Lyra's mother and father are fighting against the head angel himself, who has essentially usurped the place of God, and their daimones are helping out and also connected up with each other as they take the angel down, killing themselves in the process. I mentioned that there was this separation of daimons physically from people, and that is how you generate these soldiers that essentially have no will any longer. That's being done to some of the people within these stories. So this is a really key theme. There's a lot more that could be said about it, but this notion of seeing oneself outside of oneself, being able to have a conversation with oneself, the unloneliness that happens because of that. And actually Pullman, in an interview, does say that when he first began writing this, Lyra didn't have a daimon. This is something that comes about later. And it so enriches it that you almost can't see these books without thinking of that here. The last thing I should say about the daimons is that there is an evil kind of being, the specters, who feed upon adults. And what they're actually doing is consuming the adults' daimones and taking away their will, their agency, their who they are, their identity. So there's a lot happening with this particular theme developed in these books. One of the features of the narrative universe in going on from the Golden Compass onward is what's called dust. It's called dust in Lyra's world. It's called dark matter in our world. And it's called other things in other worlds as well. And it plays a really central role, one that we're not cognizant of early on. And I think you could say it's not even clear by the end of the Golden Compass just how important and what dust is. There's a lot of theories about it being put forward. It's also a topic that you're not supposed to bring up. But we don't really know what's going on with it until we start getting into the later two books, particularly the third one. And I should mention that the Amber Spyglass, we've got the golden compass, the, aletheometer, right, the truth-telling thing. We have the subtle knife, which opens up portals between worlds. And then we have the Amber Spyglass. The Amber Spyglass is actually something that Mary puts together that allows her to see dust, that allows her to see what is going on, which the beings of the universe that she's in can see as well. And the first reference to dust is very early on. It's in the second chapter of the Golden Compass. Lord Asriel is having them take a look at some photographs that he's taken, and we see that he says, "I'd like you to take a look at another one taken from the same spot only a minute later with a new specially prepared emulsion." He lifted out the first slide, dropped another into the frame. This was much darker. It was as if the moonlight had been filtered out. The horizon was still visible with the dark shape of the hut and its light snow-covered roof standing out, but the complexity of the instruments was hidden in darkness. But the man had altogether changed. He was bathed in light, and a fountain of glowing particles seemed to be streaming from his upraised hand. "That light," said the chaplain, "is it going up or coming down?" "It's coming down," said Lord Asriel, "but it isn't light. It's dust." Something in the way he said it made Lyra imagine dust with a capital letter, as if this wasn't ordinary dust. The reaction of the scholars confirmed her feeling because Lord Asriel's words caused a sudden collective silence followed by grasps of incredulity. And so he says, "It's dust," Lord Asriel repeated. "It's registered as light on the plate because particles of dust affect this emulsion as photons affect silver nitrate. It was partly to test it that my expedition went north in the first place." And now the question is, well, who cares? What's so important about this dust stuff? Well, a little bit later on in the story, what we find out is that there's a reference to it, you could say. This is talking about the world of spirits and other worlds and the witches. And Father Coram asks, what's going on with the Aurora? And John Fa is talking. And John Fa says, "Is this thing of the Aurora anything to do with dust?" And the Goose Diamond says, "All I can tell you is that the dust hunters are as frightened of it as if it were deadly poison. That's why they imprisoned Lord Asriel." And she says, "But why?" Here's the answer. They think he intends to use dust in some way in order to make a bridge between this world and the world beyond the Aurora. Now, that's not what actually happens. Something else is going to make that bridge. But, the magisterium is really quite afraid of what people might do about dust. And then, towards the end of that book, we find out there's this whole interesting backstory. Lyra asks, "What's dust? Why is everyone so afraid of it?" And, she's talking here about the, aletheometer, right? And he looked at her as if trying to guess whether she would understand what he was about to say. He'd never looked at her seriously before, she thought, and now she'd been like an adult, and until now he'd been like an adult indulging a child in a pretty trick. But he seemed to think she was ready. Dust is what makes the aletheometer work. Ah, I thought it might, but what else? How did they find out about it? In one way, the church has always been aware of it. They've been preaching about dust for centuries, only they didn't call it that name. But some years ago, a Muscovite called Boris Mikhailovich Rusakov discovered a new kind of elementary particle. You've heard of electrons, photons, neutrinos, all the rest. They're called elementary particles because you can't break them down any further. There's nothing inside them but themselves. Well, this new kind of particle was elementary, all right, but it was hard to measure because it didn't react in any of the usual ways. The hardest thing for Rusakov to understand was why the new particles seemed to cluster where human beings were, as if it were attracted to us, and especially to adults. Children too, but not nearly so much until their demons have taken a fixed form. During the years of puberty, they begin to attract dust more strongly, and it settles on them as it settles on adults. Now, all discoveries of this sort, because they have a bearing on the doctrines of the Church, have to be announced through the magisterium in Geneva. And this discovery of Russakoff's is so unlikely and strange that the inspector from the consistorial court of discipline suspected Russakoff of diabolic possession. They performed an exorcism in the laboratory. He interrogated Russakoff under the rules of the Inquisition. Finally, they had to accept the idea that the fact that Russakoff wasn't lying or deceiving them. Dust really existed. That left them with the problem of deciding what it was, and given the Church's nature, there was only one thing they could have chosen. The magisterium decided that dust was the physical evidence for original sin. So, dust is being misinterpreted by the magisterium as, what reflects original sin, the sin of Adam and Eve. We learn a bit more in The Subtle Knife. There are some other important discussions and passages, right? And the most important is where Lyra and Dr. Malone, Mary, meet up. Dr. Malone is engaging with these things that are called the shadows, right? And Lyra comes in there, and they're talking. Lyra tells her that the aleithiometer works by dust. She came all the way to find out more about dust, and it told me to come to you, Mary. So I reckon your dark matter must be the same thing as dust. And there's a computer set up that allows them to communicate with the dark matter, or the shadows, as Dr. Malone is calling it. Dr. Malone says the room's full of shadows, the universe is full of shadows, come to that, but this is the only way we can see them, when you make your mind empty and look at the screen. Off you go. And so she's working with the aleithiometer. Mary Malone will realize that you can actually use the I Ching as well. And Lyra is saying, is this dust? Is this the same thing, making these patterns and moving the needle of the aleithiometer? She's asking that to the aleithiometer. She's communicating with the dust. Dr. Malone says, you've just put on the best display I've ever seen. That's all. What were you doing? What were you thinking? I was thinking you could get it clearer than this. Clearer? That's the clearest it's ever been. But what does it mean? Can you read it? And Malone says, you don't read it in the sense of reading a message. It doesn't work like that. What's happening is that the shadows are responding to the attention that you pay them. That's revolutionary enough. It's our consciousness that they respond to, you see. Then there's, messages going on. The screen responded as quickly as thought itself, and out of the welter of lines and flashes, a new set of pictures formed with perfect clarity. Compasses, alpha and omega again, lightning, angel. Each picture flashed up a different number of times, and then came a different three, camel garden, moon. Lyra saw their meanings and unfocused her mind to explain. What it says, it's saying in my language, the language of pictures, but what it says is you could use ordinary language too, words, if you fix it up like that. You could fix this so it put words on the screen. But you need a lot of careful figuring with numbers, and the lightning meant electric power, and the angel, that's about messages. And maybe there's a way they have in my country of talking to dust. Shadows, same as you've got here with pictures, only their way uses sticks. So this is the I Ching reference. And Mary Malone is actually going to begin talking through the computer with the dust, with the dark matter, with the shadows through the computer. And then she has to flee. And she, in effect, actually flees to another world, the world that is discussed in the Amber Spyglass. Well, one of the worlds discussed, and now we learn more about dust, right? We learn about it, at first, through an angel. Turns out there's all these angels, and Will is talking with Baruch, and Baruch says, I think we should tell you our information. This is why we've been seeking you, why we must take you to Lord Asriel. We discovered a secret of the kingdom, of the authority, that's God's, world, and we must share it with him. Are we safe here? There's no way through? And so he says, tell me then, said Will, tell me about Metatron, who's almost attacked them, right? And what this secret is. Why did that angel call him regent? And what's the authority? Is it God? He sat down, and the two angels, their forms clearer in the moonlight than he'd ever seen them before, sat with him. Balthamos said quietly, and this is a major revelation, the authority, God, the Creator, the Lord, Yahweh, El, Adonai, the King, the Father, the Almighty, those were all names he gave himself. He was never the Creator. He was an angel like ourselves, the first angel, true, the most powerful, but he was formed of dust, as we are, and dust is only a name for what happens when matter begins to understand itself. Matter loves matter. It seeks to know more about itself, and dust is formed. The first angels condensed out of dust, and the authority was the first of all. He told those who came after him that he had created them, but it was a lie. One of those who came later was wiser than he was, and she found out the truth, and so he banished her. We serve her still, and the authority still reigns in the kingdom, and Metatron is his regent. So we got a lot of different themes working out there, right? We've got this origin of God as not really being God. It's kind of a Gnostic story, except that there's no total escape to even a higher God or anything like that. We've also got this notion of what we can call emergence, right? Matter becomes conscious of itself. That is dust. It becomes conscious and loves itself. And the angels, the original angels, are formed of conglomerations or whatever it's going to be of that, and the first of them lies to the later ones about his very origin, right? So we've got two really important themes overlapping here, right? There's more to tell about Metatron and the authority and all of that, but we'll skip that and jump ahead to talking more about dust. Now, the church, the magisterium in Lyra's world, is very concerned with dust. And they're having a big meeting, and they say, fourthly, dust. I've taken steps to find out what the Oblation Board has discovered about it, because one of the things in the magisterium is there's all these agencies working at cross purposes with each other. One of the experimental theologians working at Bolvangar has been persuaded to tell us exactly what they discovered. I shall talk to him this afternoon later. And now, the president says, whatever we do learn about dust, we must bear our purpose firmly in mind. The Oblation Board sought to understand the effects of dust. We must destroy it altogether. Nothing less than that. If in order to destroy dust, we have to destroy the Oblation Board, the College of Bishops, every single agency by which the Holy Church does the work of the authority, then so be it. It may be, gentlemen, that the Holy Church itself was brought into being to perform this very task and perish in the doing of it. But better a world with no church and no dust than a world where every day we have to struggle under the hideous burden of sin. Better a world purged of all of that. So we've got, Lord Asriel thinking he can use dust to break through. We have the church saying we need to get rid of dust. We have, Mary and Lyra and Will and many others coming to realize that dust is something incredibly important. Getting rid of it would actually be a big problem. It's not something you can exploit. And much later on, after the Amber Spyglass is actually formed that allows Mary to see these incredible, currents flowing through the air and around the living beings, we find out about the ecological or trans-world ecological crisis of dust that has been going on. And this is going to lead us to something very important later on. So, Mary gets out the spyglass. Through it, she saw two quite different movements in the sky. One was that of the clouds, driven across the moon in one direction. The other was of the stream of dust, seeming to cross it in quite another. And of the two, the dust was flowing more quickly and at much greater volume. In fact, the whole sky seemed to be flowing with it, a great inexorable flood pouring out of the world, out of all the worlds, into some ultimate emptiness. Now, that's a big problem, because for the world that she's in, the dust fertilizes these trees that these wheels are found on, that the intelligent species, who use these wheels and their oil to live their existence, right? All of this is going to go away if dust goes away. So she says, slowly, as if they were moving themselves in her mind, things joined up. Will and Lyra had said the subtle knife was 300 years old at least. So the old man in the tower had told them. The Mulefa, this intelligent race, told her that the Sraf, which had nurtured their lives and their world for 33,000 years, had begun to fail just over 300 years ago. According to Will, the guild of the Torre degli Angeli, the owners of the subtle knife, had been careless. They hadn't always closed the windows that they had opened with the knife. Mary had found one, and there must be many others. Suppose that all this time, little by little, dust had been leaking out of the wounds the subtle knife had made in nature. The subtle knife was responsible for the small-scale, low-level leakage. It was damaging, and the universe was suffering because of it, and she must talk to Will and Lyra and find a way to stop it. But the vast flood in the sky was another matter entirely. This was new, and it was catastrophic. And if it wasn't stopped, all conscious life would come to an end. As the Mulefa had shown her, dust came into being when living things became conscious of themselves, but it needed some feedback system to reinforce it and make it safe, as the Mulefa had their wheels and oil from the trees. Without something like that, it would all vanish. And now this shows us the depth of the catastrophe that's threatening them. Thought, imagination, feeling would all wither and blow away, leaving nothing but a brutish automatism, and that brief period in when life was conscious of itself would flicker out like a candle in every one of the billions of worlds where it had burned brightly. So this is a really significant insight, and this is a really significant problem as well. And what we find is that, there we go, they are talking about this entire issue, and Pan, Lyra's demon, reveals to them something about these portals that have been opened up. Pan says it's about dust, and Will marveled to hear part of his own nature, it was Will's demon, telling him something he didn't know. It was all flowing away, all the dust there was, down into the abyss that you saw. Something stopped it flowing down there, but Will, it was that golden light, Lyra said, the light that flowed into the abyss and vanished, and that was dust. Yes, but there's more leaking out all the time, Pantalaimon went on, and it mustn't all leak away. It's got to stay in the world and not vanish, because otherwise everything good will fade away and die. But where's the rest leaving from, said Lyra. Both daimons looked at Will and at the knife. Every time we made an opening, said Kirjava, and again Will felt that little thrill. She's me and I'm her. Every time anyone made an opening between worlds, or the old guild men, anyone the knife cut into the emptiness outside. The same emptiness is there down in the abyss. We never knew, no one knew, because the edge was too fine to see. But if it was quite big enough for dust to leak out of, if they closed it up at once, there wasn't much time for much to leak out, but there were thousands that they never closed up. So all this time, dust has been leaking out of the worlds and into nothingness. So what is the response that they have to have for this? The understanding was beginning to dawn on Will and Lyra. Every opening, Lyra said in a whisper. Every single one, they must all be closed, said Will. Every single one, said Pantalaimon, whispering like Lyra. Oh no, it can't be true. And so that is what they, in fact, have to do. Close up every single point of contact, every slippage between the worlds to preserve dust in there. So what is this dust? This is what gives us consciousness, what gives us, as he said a little bit earlier in it, what gives us feeling, what gives us thought, what gives us imagination, what gives us our affective and cognitive and intellective powers. This is what's being revealed as something that emerges out of matter itself, something kind of miraculous, but also something that obeys its own laws. This is the dark material, you could say, although that's taken from a bit of poetry, that lies in this entire world of this trilogy. And so that's a really absolutely key theme. A third great philosophical theme in Philip Pullman's Trilogy of the Dark Materials is the force of love. Love between lovers, love in many other ways, but I'm going to focus here on that between lovers, specifically Lyra and Will, and that between her mother and father, which generated her and then split them apart, and then they come together towards the end of the Amber Spyglass. And there will be some spoilers here because I can't really adequately talk about this without going into what happens to the love between Will and Lyra. Before that, though, we have this face-off between Metatron, the angel who is, speaking on behalf of the authority, who's kind of behind the scenes running the show, and the two lovers of Mrs. Coulter and Lord Asriel, who had, sired Lyra, who have been, at cross purposes so often. They are going to team up along with their daimons and fight Metatron to drag him into the void where they can destroy him. Why? So that they can give Lyra some time and space to accomplish what they need to do. And so there's this wonderful scene here. He took her into his arms, and the golden monkey embraced the snow leopard's neck and buried his black face in her fur. "Is Lyra safe? Has she found her daimon?" she whispered. "The ghost of the boy's father is protecting both of them. Dust is beautiful, I never knew." "What did you tell him?" Thinking about Metatron. "I lied and lied, Asriel. Let's not wait too long. I can't bear it. We won't live, will we? We won't survive like the ghosts. Not if we fall into the abyss. We came here to give Lyra time to find her daimon, and when the time to live and grow up, if we take Metatron to extinction, Marissa, she'll have that time, and if we go with him, it doesn't matter. And Lyra will be safe?" "Yes, yes," he said gently. He kissed her. She felt as soft and light in his arms as she had when Lyra was conceived 13 years before. She was sobbing quietly. When she could speak, she whispered, "I told him I was going to betray you and betray Lyra, and he believed me because I was corrupt and full of wickedness. He looked so deep I felt sure he'd see the truth, but I lied too well. I was lying with every nerve and fiber and everything I've ever done. I wanted him to find no good in me, and he didn't. There is none. But I love Lyra. Where did this love come from? I don't know. It came to me like a thief in the night, and now I love her so much that my heart is bursting with it. All I could hope was that my crimes were so monstrous that the love was no bigger than a mustard seed in the shadow of them, and I wished I'd committed even greater ones to hide it more deeply still, but the mustard seed had taken root and was growing, and the little green shoot was splitting my heart wide open, and I was so afraid that he'd see." A little bit later, he kissed her, saying, "Lyra will be safe, and the kingdom will be powerless against her. Call him now, Marissa, my love." So they call him, and they fight, and they go down into the abyss together. And then afterwards, not too long afterwards, we find out that what happens with them. And there's a discussion here about love between Will and Lyra, where, here we go. They're talking about his father. The witch killed him. He had never really understood that. He explained what she'd told him before she killed herself. She loved John Perry, and he'd scorned her. "Witches are fierce, though," Lyra said. "But if she loved him, Well, said Mary, love is ferocious too. But he loved my mother, said Will, and I can tell her that he was never unfaithful. Lyra, looking at Will, thought that if he fell in love, he would be like that, completely faithful. And that is indeed what is going to be happening soon. So we see them together, and they're on their own in another place. She takes one of the little red fruits. With a fast-beating heart, she turns to him and says, Will, and she lifted the fruit gently to his mouth. She could see from his eyes he knew at once what she meant, and he was too joyful to speak. His fingers were still at his lips, and he felt them tremble, and he put his own hand to hold hers there. Then neither of them could look. They were confused. They were brimming with happiness. Like two moths clumsily bumping together with no more weight than that, their lips touched. Then before they knew how it happened, they were clinging together, blindly pressing their faces toward each other. Like Mary said, he whispered, you know straight away when you like someone. When you were asleep on the mountain before she took you away, I told Pan, I heard, she whispered. I was awake and I wanted to tell you the same, and now I know what I must have felt all the time. I love you, Will, I love you. The word love set his nerves ablaze. All his body thrilled with it. And he answered her in the same words, kissing her hot face over and over, drinking in with adoration the scent of her body and her warm, honey-fragrant hair and her sweet, moist mouth that tasted of the little red fruit. Now, this is going to produce something very important. Something new happens. The terrible flood of dust in the sky stopped flowing. It wasn't still by any means. Mary scanned the whole sky with the amber lens, seeing a current here, an eddy there, a vortex farther off. It was in perpetual movement, but it wasn't flowing away anymore. In fact, if anything, it was falling like snowflakes. What had done that? The young ones, said Atal. Mary turned, spyglass in hand, to see Will and Lyra returning. They were some ways off. They weren't hurrying. They were holding hands, talking together, heads close, oblivious to everything else. She could see that even from a distance. She nearly put the spyglass to her eye, but held back and returned it to her pocket. There was no need for the glass. She knew what she would see. They would seem to be made of living gold. They would seem the true image of what human beings always could be once they had come into their inheritance. The dust pouring down from the stars had found a living home again, and these children, no longer children, saturated with love, were the cause of it all. Love has a metaphysical and ecological import going beyond just these two young lovers who have changed the course of that. And a little bit later, Serafina says, they did this. Something happened today or yesterday, if it's after midnight, Mary said, trying to find the words to explain and remembering her vision of the dust flow as a great river like the Mississippi. Something tiny but crucial. If you wanted to divert a mighty river into a different course and all you had was a single pebble, you could do it, provided you put the pebble in the right place to send the first trickle of water this way instead of that. Something like that happened yesterday. I don't know what it was. They saw each other differently or something. And until then, they hadn't felt like that. And suddenly they did. And then the dust was attracted to them very powerfully. And it started flowing the other way. So, again, a miracle is happening, bringing things together. Then, after that, we find that, Will and Lyra have to figure out what they're going to do. And she says, oh, Will, what can we do? Whatever can we do? I want to live with you forever. I want to kiss you and lie down with you and wake up every day of my life till I die, years and years and years away. I don't want a memory, just a memory. No, he said, memory is a poor thing to have. It's your own real hair and mouth and arms and eyes and hands I want. I didn't know I could ever love anything so much. Oh, Lyra, I wish this night would never end. If only we could stay here like this and the world could stop turning and everyone else could fall into his sleep. Everyone else except for us, and you and I could live here forever and just love each other. And then Will says, I will love you forever, whatever happens, till I die and after I die, and when I find my way out of the land of the dead, I'll drift about forever all my atoms until I find you again. And then she says, I'll be looking for you, Will, every moment, every single moment, and when we do find each other again, we'll cling together so tight that nothing and no one will ever tear us apart. Every atom of me and every atom of you will live in birds and flowers and dragonflies and pine trees and in clouds and in those little specks of light you see floating in sunbeams. And when they use our atoms to make new lives, they won't be able to take just one. They'll have to take two. One of you and one of me will be joined so tight. Isn't this remarkable prose? And isn't it so relatable if you've ever felt deep love? Their daimons come together now, and they break the taboo of not touching each other's daimons. Will put her hand on hers. A new mood had taken hold of him, and he felt resolute and peaceful, knowing exactly what he was doing and exactly what it would mean. He moved his hand from Leiber's wrist and stroked the red gold fur of her daimon. Lyra gasped. But her surprise was mixed with a pleasure so like the joy that flooded through her when she had put the fruit to his lips that she couldn't protest because she was breathless. With a racing heart, she responded in the same way. She put her hand on the silky warmth of Will's daimon, and as their fingers tightened in the fur, she knew that Will was feeling exactly what she was. And she knew, too, that neither daimon would change now, having felt a lover's hand on them. They were their shapes for life. They would want no other. So we have this remarkable, love that changes the course of this conscious matter that is dust, that helps, conscious beings be what they are throughout the multiverse. We have lovers who, we often say, oh, you're my soulmate. They actually touch each other's souls. Is this a happy ending? It certainly seems like it. But it can't be a happy ending because they have to seal up all of the gateways. And that means that they have to live in their own worlds. Because Will could live in Lyra's world, but he would sicken and die by 10 years. And Lyra could do the same, but neither of them want to see their lover waste away. So they have to live in separate worlds. And here's what we find them doing. Lyra tugs at Will's hand and leads him past a pool with a fountain under a widespread tree, then goes off to the left between beds of plants towards a many-trunk pine. She leads him to a wooden seat under a spreading, low-branched tree. I'd hoped so much. Here it is, just the same. Will, I used to come here in my Oxford and sit on this exact same bench. Whenever I wanted to be alone, just me and Pan, what I thought is if you, maybe just once a year, could come here at the same time for an hour or something, we could pretend we were close again because we would be close. And that's all that they have, and that's where we're going to end this examination of these amazing books.